Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is January 22nd, 2024, Monday, January 22nd, 2024. If you hear some strange noises in the background, it's the daytime. I have a lot of exotic animals, including non exotic dogs. So every once in a while, if you hear that weird, unusual noise, or maybe an occasional bark, yes, the source is me. But anyway, let's get on to the first story, and it's out of Stranger Than Fiction stories, and it's titled A Ghost Story from 1884. It was a roomy but old fashioned house, a low two-story structure built in the shape of a T. It had a cluster of tall chimneys in the middle and three gables hidden in ivy. When built, it had been quite out of town, but soon cottages and villas surrounded the high walls enclosing the grounds. The lawn was shaded with old trees, and the garden had thickets of lilac and snowball. Mrs. Gage lived there for 40 years. The last 20 she had lived only on the ground floor. She was an invalid and lived a secluded life. She had made little effort to keep the property up, and it decayed as she did herself. She died and it was placed for sale. A young family moved there and immediately made improvements, including the garden. They placed rustic seats under an old tree at the further end of the central walk. It had a huge gnarled trunk and was covered with ivy. Soon, however, the young wife said the spot under the tree's canopy made her uneasy. She even suggested the tree should be cut down. She said, "I don't know why it is, but I always feel nervous here. I fancy there is something peculiar about the place, in the rustling of the ivy and in the very atmosphere. I often find myself starting and looking around with a vague sense of something horrible. I hate the sight of that tree, with its distorted shape and bare skeleton arms." The husband agreed to remove the plant. He planned to ask a man who was taking down a portion of the wall which separated their garden from the neighbor. It was made of stone, but the mortar had fallen out, and what was left was little more than a pile of loose stone. Once the wall was gone, the older couple, who were their neighbors, invited them over to see the old gentleman's collection of roses. The woman told the couple that in the 10 years they had lived there, they had seen the prior occupant only twice. However, she had not always been this way. The old lady had once been married and had a daughter. The girl was pretty and spoiled, and she fell in love with a man her parents did not approve of. They forbid the relationship, but she eloped, taking her jewelry, $500 from her father's desk, and leaving only a note. The parents tried to find her, and the only one they found was her lover, who denied any knowledge of an elopement. He had received letters from her, planning an elopement, but suddenly they had stopped, and he never heard from her again. The old neighbor told the young wife this is how the daughter escaped from the house. She had mounted the sloping trunk of the old tree at the foot of the garden walk and stepped along its horizontal branches to the top of the wall. The parents had found broken twigs and scattered leaves at the foot of the tree. On the ground outside the wall was found her shawl, and that was all. When the workmen came to cut down the tree, they heard something rattling inside of it. They discovered bones, but they weren't sure if they were human or not. The owner of the house directed that the trunk should be felled. When they did, it exposed a hollow stump in which lay a mass of human bones with remains of a woman's dress. Below this were jewels and gold and silver coin. The elderly neighbor who came to look at the tree of the felling of the tree said there could be no doubt this was the daughter who had run away. It was believed she threw her shawl over the wall so it would not get in her way, and she failed to see the deep hole covered over by ivy. It became her living tomb. Her cries would not have been heard since the house stood apart, and her parents had left home and gone in pursuit of her. A clergyman was hired to give a Christian burial to the remains, but no one else was told of the discovery, and the dark atmosphere in this part of the garden disappeared. Interesting story. And a couple of weeks ago, no, as a matter of fact, my last transmission, I went back and I read it. By the way, this is supposed to be a true story, even though it was quite a while back, over 100 years. But also, this was a real life story, which is Bella's Bones, which is something that they discovered, something very similar, but it happened right after World War II. This one right here, where 1943, they found a woman's uh, skeletal remains inside a what they call a witch elm in England, and that was never solved. That was never solved as to who she was, who put her there, because again, it was a very narrow spot. No, but in other words, like this story, unless you fell through or were dead, or nobody would go in there by themselves. There was no place where you could, for some reason, go there and not crawl out. But there you go. The next story is out of IFL Science, and it's titled Tourists Return Stones to Pompeii Explaining I Didn't Know About the Curse. If anywhere is going to be cursed, it's the ancient Roman city of Pompeii, where thousands of bodies are perfectly preserved by the volcanic ash and pumice from an extraordinarily powerful eruption that wiped out everything, including neighboring town Herculaneum, thousands of years ago. Even rational people who know curses are not a thing might think twice about removing an ancient artifact from its eerie grounds, even after overcoming the obvious moral reasons why you shouldn't steal historic items in the first place. Not so for many tourists, apparently. Over the years, hundreds of items have been taken from the UNESCO World Heritage Site before either being returned in a fit of conscience years later, or because the thieves believed themselves cursed by the objects, usually sent back with letters of apology. So many so, in fact, that Pompeii has a permanent exhibition of these items and the accompanying remorse. Gabriel Zukrich, no, I'm sorry, Zutrije, director of the Archaeological Park in Pompeii, recently shared such a note that had been placed at the site by a remorseful visitor. I didn't know about the curse, the letter read, in all caps. I didn't know that I should not take any rocks. Within a year, I got breast cancer. I'm a young and healthy female, and doctors said it was just bad luck. Please accept my apology in these pieces. Similar letters have been sent to Pompeii accompanying artifacts. I am now 36 and had breast cancer twice, one unfortunate visitor wrote in 2020. The last time ending in a double mastectomy. My family and I also had financial problems. We're good people, and I don't want to pass this curse on to my family or children. The curse is, of course, not a real thing. People are attributing bad or unlikely events in their lives to the artifacts after hearing about the supposed curse, a sort of confirmation bias, as well as a misunderstanding of statistics. It may seem unlikely that one young person would get cancer 1 year after removing an artifact from Pompeii. But if a fair amount of young people remove artifacts from Pompeii, the odds are far shorter that one of this group will go on to develop cancer. If enough people took artifacts from, for example, an In-N-Out burger, a small portion of them would go on to have terrible lives. This isn't a burn on the customer base, merely statistics. Nobody would say that In-N-Out burger is cursed. The larger group of people who didn't get cancer or any other perceived bad luck are the ones who don't tend to shout about it. I took the rock years ago and everything basically has been fine. Isn't exactly an all-time great anecdote. So, what do you think? Do you think that um, there is such a thing as cursed objects? How about, because I mean, I know there's ghost towns out in the Southwest that have developed that reputation that if you take what's the name of it? I can't remember the name of that ghost town. Very similar, that people take just a rock, not even an artifact per se, nothing that you can say is of value like a doorknob. They just take a rock, anything just from the land, and they do the same thing. They end up returning it, saying, oh, they had a streak of bad luck. Something to think about, huh? Next story is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and this is titled Blame It on Bigfoot. Modern day Sasquatch lore paints this cryptid as being very wary of man and watching him only from afar. However, Native American tribes for centuries have painted a different picture of Bigfoot. They describe how, given the chance, they would snatch up women or children and take them away, never to be seen again. Some tribes believed Bigfoot would take humans to feed on them. Others believed they used them for sexual purposes. How did Sasquatch nature become so different in modern times? In 1924, Albert Ostman was on a prospecting trip about 75 miles north of the head of Toba Inlet. He was warned by an old Indian about the mountain giants that lived in the area. Albert didn't believe him. Then he noticed that during the night his belongings were being messed with, and then some of the food started to disappear. He was kidnapped during the night while he slept in his sleeping bag, Ostman said. I didn't know it was the old man Sasquatch at the time. All I knew is that I was being carried and that the sleeping bag was pulled so tight around my neck that I almost choked. He just slung me over his shoulder and away we went. He had his knife and rifle inside the sleeping bag with him, but his kidnapper trudged for 3 hours before they reached the cave. It was occupied by an older female Sasquatch and a younger male and female. He described the old man as weighing about 500 to 600 pounds and measuring 7 feet in height. The old lady was a little shorter, and the other two measured about 6 feet and weighed about 200 pounds. He said they ate fruits and nuts and no meat. He thought they were just curious about him. However, if he made an attempt to leave, the old man would block the way. Ostman had been with the Sasquatch about a week and was starting to run short of supplies. He realized he would have to escape somehow. There's more than one version of how he made his escape. In one, he took out a box of snuff or tobacco, which the old man tried to eat, and it made him sick. While the others hovered around the older Bigfoot, Ostman grabbed his belongings and fled. He made the getaway without pursuit. In another version, the female Bigfoot chased him, and he shot her in the neck. He was rescued by a passing motorist who took him to a nearby town. Fearing that he would be called crazy, he didn't tell his story until 1957, when another man, William Rowe, described seeing a Bigfoot in the area where he had been taken. He described the Bigfoot speech as a sort of chattering. When asked why he thought he had been taken, he thought they might have wanted him to mate with a young female. Ostman died in 1975. In 1928, a trapper named Mushalat Harry from the Nootka tribe was kidnapped by a large tribe of Bigfoot on Vancouver Island. He was asleep in a lean-to when he was scooped up by a Bigfoot and taken to their camp, where there were about 20 creatures. They examined him, feeling his skin, and then seemed to become bored and ignored him. Seizing the opportunity, he escaped and never went into the woods again. Contrary to Ostman's experience, he thought he was taken as a meal. There were earlier stories about Bigfoot when the Pacific coast was being explored. In 1810, a Northwest Fur and Trading Company agent named David Thompson told of finding footprints measuring 14 inches long and 8 inches wide. He knew the prints did not belong to a bear, and the Indians told them they belonged to mammoth. In 1840, Elkanah Walker, a missionary to the Spokane Indians, reported in their belief in a race of giants which inhabited a certain mountain off to the west of them. There is a more recent story in which Bigfoot was named as an abductor. It started on June 1st, 1987, when Teresa Ann Beer, 16, went to the Sierra Nevada mountains with Russell Skip Welch, 43, who considered himself a Bigfoot expert. He took the teenager to the area of Shut-Eye Peak on what was supposed to be a trip to find the creatures. He claimed to have had contact with Sasquatches in the past. What happened on the trip remains a mystery. All that is known is that Welch returned to Fresno without Teresa Beer. When interrogated by the sheriff's deputies, he said they had become separated and that she was abducted by one of the creatures. Skip said that Teresa would not be returning because she'd be happier with the Bigfoot community in the mountains rather than her own home. Needless to say, the police didn't put much stock in the story. They searched the area where they had camped, but couldn't find any evidence of a crime, and much less a clue to where Teresa could be found. They did find a stage camp that Welch had set up, and finally the original camp they had been at, but no evidence of a kill site. One of Welch's shirts was also found with meth in a pocket. Welch was charged with child stealing, but the charges were dropped 3 days before he was to stand trial. Without physical evidence, perhaps the prosecution had second thoughts they could get a conviction. This would free Welch from any future prosecution if the girl or her remains were found. The wait has been long and decades have passed without any clue of what happened to Teresa Beer. Teresa was not only unfortunate in what happened in those days of 1987, but in her life in general. She was born to abusive parents Shirley and David Beer. Her mother broke her leg when she was 3 years old, and another time broke the child's ribs. Teresa and her sister Vicky were placed in foster care. Teresa's parents divorced, and several years later, her father wanted to regain custody. His second wife had once been married to his ex-wife's half-brother. Teresa Beer's stepmother, Margie Richmond, also turned out to be abusive, not only towards Teresa but her own natural-born daughters. Eventually, Teresa returned to Fresno to her great-grandmother's house, where her uncle John Blind Johnny Richmond was granted custody. He had lost his eyesight while playing Russian roulette. John would make Teresa miss school so she could babysit his sons. It was claimed he and his friends sexually abused her. She was described as a slow learner and immature at school. These circumstances could explain why a teenage girl was allowed to accompany a 43-year-old man on a camping trip. It seemed she had gone willingly, but it would be hard not to believe that foul play had taken place. Welch was a one-time house painter who mostly lived off disability checks and was addicted to meth. His wife Shannon Welch had died from an overdose 2 years before. He had a reputation of taking young girls to the mountains and using drugs to lure them into having sex. But what if he had been telling the truth? Was she taken like Albert Osman and Mushalat Harry? When Mushalat Harry escaped from the Bigfoot, he was treated by Father Anthony Terhar, a priest who testified about Harry's condition. He took care of Harry for 3 weeks, during which time the Indian's hair had turned totally white. There were times the priest feared, not only for Harry's health, but his sanity. This was a man he had known to be a fearless trapper. But now he dared not go beyond the borders of his village. He believed that Harry had suffered a horrible experience. In Bigfoot Lives, Deal With It, the author wrote, every year hundreds of people disappear in the forest, and it is possible, although unlikely, that Bigfoot creatures have something to do with some of these disappearances. Since they are predatory animals, they are opportunists, and it might be possible that they would and have attacked people. What happened to Teresa Ann Beer in the Central Sierra back in 1987 seems destined to remain a mystery. She is still listed as a missing person by the Fresno Police Department. Her uncle Blind Johnny died of cancer around 2008, and Skip Welch died in 1998 at the age of 54 due to severe coronary artery disease. There have been other disappearances at Shut-Eye Peak, where Teresa Beer went missing. In 1934, Richard McPherson, 10, the son of Chester McPherson, a Forest Service lookout at Shut-Eye Peak, disappeared while on a fishing trip with his brother Robert and their cousin Howard. The three of them were caught in a spring storm, and they camped where they were that night off the headwaters of Rock Creek. Robert went to find help the next morning and left the younger boys in a temporary shelter. Robert returned with rangers, and on his way up the rocky slope, he met Howard Ibbotson coming down, who only explained that Richard had disappeared from the camp. He was found on May 28, 1934, huddled beside a large rock, and it was determined he had died from exposure. Doug Pierce, 86, disappeared in April of 2005. He was a retired nuclear engineer who went camping near Shut-Eye Peak. He didn't have medical problems and was in good physical shape. A few days after his disappearance, his white truck was found abandoned in the mud and on fire. Authorities say it appeared the vehicle caught fire accidentally, and they believe he became lost when he tried to walk out of the mountains. As of 2023, he has not been found. James Arthur, 67, was a military veteran, and he went missing on July 28th. He left to go on a hike or fishing trip to Star Lakes in the Sierra National Forest. He planned to return home the same day. His blue Dodge Ram pickup truck was found near the entrance to Iron Lakes on Beesore Drive. This is 14 miles from Star Lake. 2 persons reported seeing Arthur on a steep trail to Iron Lakes, and they spoke to him a little. He was an experienced hiker with no health problems. No evidence or remains have ever turned up since he disappeared. Since late June 2020, Sandra Johnson Hughes, 54, has been missing. She went on a solo camping trip to the area of Shut-Eye Peak in the Sierra National Forest. Before she disappeared, she was spotted wandering barefoot with a bruise on her face. This witness said he offered help, but she declined. Her campsite was found with personal documents and items scattered, which was contrary to what was known about this person's habits. Her silver Saab was found crashed in the woods. She has not been found as of 2023, and she's listed as alive but missing until evidence surfaced otherwise. She was an experienced outdoor enthusiast. She was sighted on July 4th, 2020 at Chiquito Pass Trailhead. A sleeping bag she had recently purchased was found a few days later, off a, off a trail about 2.5 miles north of where her vehicle was found. She was reportedly spotted again on August 9, 2020, when two hunters told police they saw a woman leaning against a tree along Road 501 near Bisord Road. She did not seem to be in distress, but did look thinner than her photos. These sightings took place close to the massive creek fire that began in September 2020. So you ask yourself, what's the common denominator? Is it something going on in these places where people disappear? Is it the fact that for some reason they decide to go off and do this by themselves? Does Bigfoot play a part in any of this? Whether it's a kidnapping for whatever the reasons they gave, food, curiosity, sexual, I don't know. Who knows? Is it a combination of things? Honestly, I think just like this lady that disappeared, there were so many sightings of her. And again, there's nothing against the law of going to hike or whatever, camp by yourself. But at the same time, it's like there seems to be, like, as far as I'm concerned, a lack of self-preservation, you know? So there you go. But of course, a lot of times people blame it on Bigfoot, and then maybe he deserves it, maybe he doesn't, or maybe he does do things, if he exists, out of expediency, hunger, sickness. Maybe he or she cannot find their usual prey. So let me tell you something. As big as Bigfoots are, they need a lot of calories to maintain a body that big. And personally, I don't think all they do is just eat nuts and berries. I don't go for that one. Anyway, let's go on to the next story. This next story is out of Outkick, and it's titled Outkick Reader and Former Cop Shares Two Insane Paranormal Experiences. Outkick readers know the paranormal and UFOs are all the craze these days, and one reader reached out with a pair of stories that are nothing short of shocking. All right. This is the first story. I was contacted by David Hookstead, who identified himself by his real name and his work history as a police officer at a very large police department in New York. For the sake of the article, we'll be calling him Fred to conceal his identity. Okay, why had Fred reached out? He was intrigued by our coverage and wanted to share some of his own stories. Number one, the first story from Fred revolves around the creature hitting his squad car while he was on his patrol in 1982. On patrol one evening, during a typical cool evening, a dense fog bank settled in and I had to sign out of service simply because I couldn't see the road for more than a dozen feet or so. I started to do some normal paperwork and something ran into the front left fender of my patrol car. Whatever it was large enough to shake my patrol car, and I saw it fall down, apparently injured. I exited my car and assumed it was a deer or small bear. When I got out of the car, I saw a dent in the fender. And when I got to the front of the car, I saw a creature lying on the ground. Fred explained to me, a creature on the ground. Right. That's the... Okay. Fred further elaborated. It was moving, and when it stood up, I certainly knew it wasn't a normal animal of any type. It was kind of oval shaped and with long, spindly legs and arms and rather long feet and hands with equally long fingers and toes. It was a dull gray color all over with no visible hair or fur. It started to walk away slowly, and after a few steps it moved rather fast into a nearby yard, and then I lost sight of it. I assumed I was doing this over maybe 15 or so minutes, but when logging into service again, I discovered I was at the location for over an hour. The experience was so jarring and stunning that it caused them to question what was going on. What I saw was definitely not the usual gray we hear so much about, and when I questioned my own experience, there was the dent in the car to show it was real. In my lifetime, I've seen 3 objects of unknown type. with this occurrence being the only being I ever encountered. It was not hostile, and at best I would say it was simply curious, the now retired former police officer explained. His story involved an unknown paranormal creature. And you know what? Uh, Again, you hear a lot about these people, whether they're military or police officers, that while they're on duty, they keep it to themselves and they wait till they're retired before they talk about these stories. Okay. Let's see. Then this is another story. About 2 years ago, my wife and I were scanning the television looking for a show to watch, and we saw fuzzy video taken by a person's security camera by their patio. Let me see if I can get rid of this. Oh, come on. Let's see. By their patio. It was grainy, but showed a creature exactly like the one I saw in person, which at most was just outside my arm's reach. When I first saw the creature, I envisioned it with knees that were backwards, but the video I saw showed the knees were normal, but the legs were widely skewed or compressed. I figured if the legs were fully extended, they would make the creature appear to be 7 to 9 feet tall, but as it was, it only looked a bit over 5 to 6 feet tall. Fred explained. I'll be the first to admit the details sound a bit crazy, but given my experience back in Wisconsin with my close contact in the hunters, I was in a state of shock hearing Fred's story. This is what the person that interviewed him said. Then incident number 2. Um, let's say, turns out his own experience something. Okay, here we go. In about 1973 or so, New York State Parkway Police had a pursuit on southbound Meadowbrook Parkway, chasing a vehicle well in excess of 100 miles per hour. Since my sector was mostly residential, my RMP was a standard vehicle and in no way capable of that kind of speed, so I simply sat at the nearest parkway exit to observe. Fred explained when recalling the incident. The pursuit vehicle passed my location at about 130 miles per hour and went under the overpass to one exit just like you would imagine. After passing under the next exit, this vehicle went airborne and simply flew away. None of the overpasses are high enough for any type of plane or helicopter. Since this area is swampy, marine units and divers searched the waters and found nothing, not even any tire tracks leading to the water. This pursuit was observed by at least a dozen officers, and not one has ever mentioned this until I did now. Sounds crazy. Sure, but it turns out it happened right next to a missile launch location. He said there was a Nike missile station a few miles south of this occurrence, and we assumed that it had something to do with the military. The Nike missile base was in Lido, just east of Long Beach, New York. My memory of these occurrences is quite clear, and I would probably place you within 25 feet of exactly where I was when it happened. The United States had active missile sites at the time of the alleged incident in the area that Fred claims it happened in. Wow. Interesting. Two interesting stories. And like I said, a lot of these, what they call trained observers, don't say anything because they want to keep their jobs, for lack of a better word. And you get known as that guy, that person, whatever. Next story is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and it's titled Honeymooners and Murder at Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls has been a favorite destination for honeymooners for decades. Like a magnet, it also draws daredevils and those wishing to release themselves from this mortal coil. Niagara Falls is made up of 3 waterfalls that are 18,000 years old, 2 in the United States and 1 in Canada. Horseshoe Falls spans the border of both countries and empties into the Niagara River. It is the largest of the 3. The falls have a vertical drop of more than 165 feet. At the turn of the 17th century, Samuel de Champlain, a French explorer, heard of the awe-inspiring waterfall, but it was not until 1678 that Father Louis Hennepin saw them firsthand. With the advent of the railroad, Niagara Falls became a tourist destination and a favored honeymoon spot. Since 1846, the sightseeing boats that tour the falls have been named the Maid of the Mist, based on an Iroquois myth. In 1895, the first hydroelectric generator was switched on, but it was Nikola Tesla who helped divert power to Buffalo, New York, and present day produces 2.4 million kilowatts of power through hydroelectricity. In 1969, due to instability, the to instability, the fallen America was drained. This was done in order to allow geologists to examine a rock pile at the bottom. Many expected secrets to be uncovered in the endeavor, especially the most gruesome of all, which were the bodies of those that had gone over the falls, but had never been recovered. At that time, there was an average of 25 suicides per year. Police discovered the remains of a man, a woman, and the carcass of a deer amongst the rocks of the talus at the base of the falls. The man was not a mystery. He had not been there for long. There was a sighting of a man jumping into the channel above American Falls on June 11th, the day before the water was stopped. Some who saw him thought he was a worker. The man had walked along the shore until he reached the brink and jumped in from Prospect Point. The body fit the description of the man who was seen wearing a green plaid shirt and pants. He was in his 20s and has never been identified. The woman was decomposed and wedged between rocks head first. She wore a red and white horizontal striped dress. A gold wedding band was inscribed inside, "Forget Me Not." Like the man, she has never been identified. 2 months later, in August of 1969, a man's dismembered body parts were found around the Ontario hydrophore. Pieces of him came floating in for about 1 week. He was estimated to have been in his 50s to 60s. He was white, had gray or white hair with brown eyes. He had no dental work done, but his teeth were dirty and full of cavities. He had only one tooth in his upper jaw, and a few were missing from his lower jaw. The cause of death was thought to be homicide, and his identity has never been established. It's inevitable that there are ghost stories about Niagara Falls. The most obvious sources are those that have died at the falls through suicide or even murder. There is a hat man who has been seen wearing a tall hat and missing a leg from the knee down. He just disappears when approached. Another story involves one Trevor McKyler, was 16 years old when he visited Niagara Falls with his mother and sister. He was angry and believed his mother favored his 6-year-old sister Annabelle. Their father had abandoned the family 3 years before. After visiting the falls, they were on the number 7 trolley, which rides over Horseshoe Falls. Only 2 seats were available, and his mother insisted he stand so his sister could sit in one. An argument started, and Trevor will go on to jump over the falls that very day and is said to haunt trolley number 7. There is no record of this event, and it sounds childish and made up, but that doesn't mean other haunting events have not taken place there. In 1874, the body of a painter named Vetter of Drummondville, Ontario, was found in the whirlpool at Niagara. He had disappeared 2 weeks before. He wanted to marry the daughter of one Mrs. Upper, who didn't approve of the match. She hired 3 men to beat him, and he lodged a complaint with the mayor of Clifton. They lured him with a pretense of getting him a job on Navy Island, and it's believed they threw him in the river above the falls. The ruffians were named McSeevil, Flanagan, and Cross, who suddenly left the neighborhood. In 1895, on the other side of the border in Niagara, Ontario, Frank Rogers disguised himself as a ghost and planned on playing a practical joke on his Italian neighbor, who was so scared that he threw a pitchfork at Rogers, hitting him in the eye, penetrating the brain, and killing him. Talk about wrong person to play a practical joke on. In 1897, a story circulated that a woman with long flowing hair walked out from the rapids near where Elizabeth McRoberts, 66, committed suicide a month before. She would stroll about the reservation on moonlit nights and then return to the water. When the body of Elizabeth McRoberts was recovered, another badly decomposed body of a man was taken out of the whirlpool. It was thought to be the corpse of Mr. Weber, who along with 2 companions went over the falls in a rowboat. The falls would claim even those that overcame other dangerous places. Such was the case of Captain Matthew Webb, who in 1875 was the first person to swim the English Channel in 22 hours. He had already received attention before this event. He joined the merchant navy when he was a teenager and served on the Cunard Line ship Russia. He dove into the mid-Atlantic to rescue a man who went overboard. The man was not found, but Webb was awarded £100 and the first Stanhope Medal. The British press hailed him a hero. In 1863, he rescued his brother Thomas, age 12, who almost drowned in the Severn near Ironbridge. Within 10 years, he was already a captain on his own ship. After he successfully swam the English Channel, he participated in different races, and his celebrity increased. His final stunt was to swim in the Niagara Gorge through the Whirlpool Rapids, which is below Niagara Falls. Many considered this feat to be suicidal. On July 24th, 1883, he jumped into the river from a boat stationed near the Niagara Falls Suspension Bridge. He started to swim and was doing well until he reached a section of the river located near the entrance to the whirlpool where he drowned. He was buried in Oakwood Cemetery in Niagara Falls. He was 35 years old. In 1920, there were sightings of a ghost dressed in white and said to have long streaming hair. Police followed the ghost inside into a cornfield, which they surrounded and searched without finding the apparition. The police thought it was someone playing a joke. The residents believed it to be the ghost of Mrs. Rounton, who was murdered by her husband 2 years before. The Red Coach Inn is supposed to be haunted as a result of when a husband killed his bride in December 1927. He bludgeoned her to death in their bedroom. Guests described temperature changes and doors opening, also voices and a woman screaming. There is no record of this event, which probably puts it into the category of urban myth. However, there could be other sources for the story. In September 1927, Jenny Cohen, a bride of only 4 days, died in an automobile accident. She was riding with her husband over the honeymoon trail bound for Niagara Falls. The touring car rolled over twice and hit a tree. The husband was not injured. Another story involved the death of a bride after honeymooning at Niagara. This happened in September 1929. Mary Lewis, 26, was riding with her husband on the honeymoon trail when their car crashed into a cement abutment and overturned. She died on the way to the hospital and her husband was only slightly injured. In January 1935, police were sent out for a report of a nude man running about in Oakdale Cemetery on Portage Road in Niagara Falls. This was the same cemetery where the unfortunate Captain Webb was buried in 1883. A young woman coming home from work at 9:30 p.m. saw him and she told firemen at the 10th Street Fire Hall that was a block away. The naked man had whistled at her. The police found no one, so they took her home and the incident was chalked up to the man being a ghost. Perhaps it wasn't a naked man, but one just wearing a bathing suit. It was the ghost of Captain Webb. In 1959, a stranger walked into a restaurant and asked the owner, Vincent Davolio, to change a $100 bill into U.S. currency. Davolio assumed it was Canadian money, but later when he took a look at the bill, it bore the inscription Confederate States of America and dated November 20th, 1862. The man had already left. From then on, he was referred to as the Gray Ghost. In April 1972, an unoccupied car parked near the Horseshoe Falls had its lights turned on, then the lenses shattered. The horn began to blow, the engine started, then the windshield exploded when the car burst into flames. The firemen blamed it on a short circuit. For the stories of those whose luck ran out at Niagara Falls, there are those who did escape a tragic end. In August 1918, Gustav Lofberg and Frank Harris were dredging up a sandbank from the Niagara River upstream from the waterfall on the Niagara Scow. When a tugboat came to bring the scow back to shore, it broke loose and floated downriver, heading straight for the falls. They dropped the scow's 6-ton anchor, but the chain broke. Then they dumped their load of sand, and the boat got caught on a rocky shoal, only 838 yards from the edge of the falls. Since they were so close to the edge, sending a boat to rescue the two men was out of the question. The U.S. Coast Guard sent a lifeline using a cannon line to the boat from the roof of the Toronto power plant. After 17 hours, the two men made it back to shore using a breeches buoy. The wreck of the old scow, as she was also known, deteriorated over the years, and in 2019, record high water levels allowed the iron barge to drift another 50 yards downriver. In 2022, it broke into several pieces that lodged in the rapids. A similar wreck, the Sunbeam, was caught in the shoal close to the Niagara Scow in 1923. It was once a World War I anti-submarine patrol boat. Abandoned, it broke apart during the years, and the boilers and propeller shaft are seen when water is diverted for hydropower production. Present-day Niagara Falls, despite the beauty of the landscape, has a serious problem with crime. There's a high poverty rate, which has produced a significant number of violent crimes. Caution is advised when visiting the city. And that's, I like these stories because inevitably It's a mix of, bad luck, accidents, people that romanticize these places like, the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco is a place where they're going to end their lives. And they romanticize, like, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it in a place where it's got significance, which is stupid. And they do this, which is why these places like Niagara Falls has attracted, that kind of, and it makes you wonder, And then I think it's like this other one, he crossed the channel, but he decided he was going to cross Niagara. It's like, all right, what happened to your love of life kind of thing. And, but at the same time, at the end, I went to Niagara Falls like in 1984, and I took a ride in the Maid of the Mist. Takes you right to the bottom of. Very interesting. You had to wear a raincoat, by the way. It was a great trip. And now I hate to say it that because of the high crime, that going there as a tourist, yeah, it might might be your last vacation kind of thing. But there you go. All right, let's go on to the next story, which is titled. Where was it? No, let's go to this one. This is out of Vintage News, and it's titled Thousands Have Mysteriously Disappeared in the Alaska Triangle. The vast wilderness of Alaska is both majestic and menacing, a place where nature's beauty is matched only by its potential danger. Among the many mysteries that shroud the state's rugged terrain, one phenomenon has continued to intrigue and baffle both locals and outsiders alike: the Alaska Triangle. Stretching from the northern city of Barrow through Anchorage into the southeastern region of Juneau, this area has been the site of an alarming number of unexplained disappearances. What makes the Alaska Triangle particularly compelling is the sheer volume of vanishings that have occurred within its boundaries. Since 1988, it is estimated that more than 20,000 people have vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but questions. This has given rise to numerous theories and speculations as people strive to make sense of the inexplicable. The triangle's allure is not merely based on the number of disappearances, but also on the diversity of those who have gone missing, from seasoned hikers and outdoor enthusiasts to pilots and tourists. The triangle does not discriminate, swallowing up a broad spectrum of individuals. The area is also known for aircraft disappearances, with one of the most famous cases being the vanishing of United States Air Force C-54 military aircraft in 1950, carrying 44 passengers, which disappeared without a trace. Like most mysteries, people have rallied trying to explain why so many have gone missing in the Alaska Triangle. Some suggest environmental factors, such as the region's dense forest, wildlife, and harsh weather conditions, which can disorient and endanger even the most experienced adventurers. The terrain is treacherous, the weather unpredictable, and the wildlife formidable. Other points to the presence of large bodies of water, where swift rivers and glacial crevices can prove fatal. Avalanches and hidden crevasses in the ice can catch even the most careful trekkers off guard. However, there are those who believe in the existence of energy vortexes within the triangle, akin to the famed Bermuda Triangle, which are said to disrupt navigation instruments and cause spatial and temporal anomalies. Then there are the legends of creatures and spirits from indigenous folklore, which add another layer to the mystery. These stories have been passed down for generations and are as much a part of the local landscape as the mountains and forests. Behind every disappearance in the Alaska Triangle is a personal story, a family grappling with the pain of not knowing what happened to their loved one. The authorities and volunteer search teams work tirelessly, often in treacherous conditions, to provide answers but are frequently met with dead ends. The vastness and inaccessibility of the Alaska Triangle present unique challenges for search and rescue operations. Despite these difficulties, dedicated teams of rescuers often put their own lives at risk while searching for answers. These unsung heroes navigate extreme conditions and utilize both cutting edge technology and traditional techniques in their efforts to bring closure to families and unravel the mysteries of the triangle. Whether fueled by folklore, geological anomalies, or mere coincidence, despite the efforts to unveil the mystery, the Alaska Triangle continues to cause disappearances each and every year. And I would say right there, that's really the problem. It's not, like I said, yeah, people, they walk in there by themselves, planes fall, but I think that the biggest problem is that when they do send in the search and rescue, they're hindered themselves sometimes by the terrain, by the weather. If it's snowing, it's a harsh climate, even when it's normal. I think that that sometimes is one of the most important factors that when they do send somebody in there to find or rescue them, it's very difficult. Next story is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories and is titled The Silent Woman. It was 1879 when Frances Haronelli fell in love with a sea captain named Herbert Schrady. But love doesn't always bring happiness in its wake. She came from a Yugoslavian family living in San Francisco. Her relatives did not approve of the relationship, so they were probably glad when he sailed to Europe in charge of a merchant sailing vessel. It was reported to have gone down in the Straits of Gibraltar, and word reached Frances that her lover died. But she refused to believe it. There was a violent argument among them, and she took a vow that she would never open her lips in speech. She believed her family intercepted his letters to her and tried to keep them apart. Until 1886, she kept her vow, despite efforts from her friends and family. Her story was published in the newspapers, and it became to the attention of a guest staying at the Grand Hotel in San Francisco. He called on Frances Huanelli, and he told her he knew Schrady, who was now a man of wealth in St. Petersburg. He told her, knowing I was coming to San Francisco, Schrady begged me to find his old sweetheart, who he still loves. Frances, who was still pretty, sat listless, though she heard every word. The story seemed to make no impression on her. Perhaps she suspected the man had been sent by her family, but that was never proven one way or another. Maybe she knew what her fate was. A year later, on February 20th, 1887, she died at St. Luke's Hospital. Even on her deathbed, her family gathered around and implored her to break her vow, if only to say goodbye. The siblings pleaded with her as well, but she would not speak. She refused care from her family, but welcomed it from the nurses until the moment of her death. Talk about holding a grudge. Yeah, that fits the bill right there. Okay, I will be back soon with more eerie news, weird, the unusual. Don't forget you can visit strangerthanfictionstories.com if you want to read the articles, or eerie news if you want to a replay of any of these, a podcast version or a video version of any of these broadcasts. So till next time, I'll be back soon.